just a side bit information. It's fun to kind of share, those songs that, that bring up memories of whether it be weddings or funerals or when you were baptized. And so, anyways, tonight's sermon title, going on to that. Who is Jesus? Well, that might seem like a bit odd of a sermon title because you think, well, of course I know who Jesus is, Mike. We can go home right now. But we're actually going to be looking at who is Jesus from the perspective of Mark's gospel, or Mark's gospel account. And Marty and I did not plan for us both to be preaching from Mark today, and so you all are getting double portions or double servings of Mark, and so you're welcome for that. But we're going to be in Mark this evening, and so we'll solely be in Mark, and so you can be turning there or clicking there or pointing there, whether you have a physical or digital Bible, all the same words. But we'll head over there and we'll get there in a second. But tonight we're going to be talking about Mark's gospel. And each author and each book is very unique because it's written by a specific author to a specific audience for a specific purpose. Paul's letters, for example, are written to Christians in specific cities or specific churches for a specific situation, which we as 21st century Christians then take that text, we interpret it, we then apply it to our lives, and sometimes we do a good job of applying it to our lives, sometimes not. But each author is writing for a specific purpose. And Mark, we know it's a gospel account. It tells the life of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell the life of Jesus, and some of them tell different stories for different purposes or to drive home their intent for writing this. And Mark, he writes and uses the gospel account as a way to talk about this discipleship process. And if you look at Mark as a whole, you see this discipleship process throughout the whole thing, and it's building on this process. But then if you zoom in and look at individual characters in Mark, you can see how they fit into the discipleship process, or how the discipleship process interacts with them. And so you can see it on kind of a macro level, but then also on a micro level. And we'll talk more about this discipleship process and what it looks like in Mark here in a little bit, but processes are everywhere in our life. Going to the store is a process. You get in your car, you buckle your seatbelt, put the key in the ignition, turn the key, put the car in drive. Had to think of that one. But even breathing or taking in oxygen, how our body converts oxygen and puts it into our blood and goes through our body and comes out as carbon dioxide, it's a process. Our life is made up of processes. And on Sunday mornings in the high school class, we are looking at Mark. We're studying the book of Mark with our high school students, and we are talking about this discipleship process. And so I won't embarrass any of our high school students by having them come up here and tell you what the process is, but they should be able to tell you what the process is. But the process, it's a 3-step process, and it goes like this. It's called, come, and go. And it's just that easy. Now there's more to it, and we'll talk about it, its different parts. And tonight we're going to mainly focus on one particular part, but for the most part, that is the discipleship process. It's called, come, go. And in Mark chapter 1, we have the start of the discipleship process with Jesus' first calling. Mark chapter 1, verse 14. It says, after John was put in prison, Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. The time has come, he said. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. In chapter 1, Jesus sees Simon, who we know will later get his name changed to Peter. And he also sees Andrew, James, and John, and he says to them, "Come, follow me." He calls out to them. He invites these 4 individuals to come follow him. And that is what a disciple does. A disciple follows the teacher. Jesus is saying, "Come, follow me," but much deeper than that, he's saying, "Come, be my disciple." And this is where the discipleship process begins. This is where it begins for all of us. Just like Jesus calls his disciples, at some point in our lives, Jesus calls us. Jesus calls out to us and says, "Come, follow me." And it's at that moment when Jesus calls us that we have to decide if we are going to get out of the boat. We have to make a decision if we are going to get out of our boat, if we are going to leave what we know, if we are going to leave what's comfortable and choose to follow Jesus. When Jesus calls us, we have to make a decision. And that brings us to maybe a little bit of a problem with our discipleship process. You see, we said that the discipleship process, it's a 3-step process. Call, come, go. But there's almost kind of a sub-step after call. And the first one is that we have to make a decision. We have to first make a decision about Jesus. We have to answer the question of who is Jesus. And Mark actually spends the first 8 chapters of his gospel answering this question. If you want to look in verse 1 of chapter 1, that's where we'll be. Mark writes in verse 1, at the beginning of his gospel, he says, "The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God." We have the introduction of the gospel, and here in the introduction, Mark tells the readers who Jesus is. And he says, Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. He says that Jesus is the Son of God. And so from the beginning, Mark tells the answer to us as readers. As we are reading Mark, we already know from this introduction that Jesus is the Son of God. But for the next 8 chapters in Mark, he goes through proving that Jesus is the Son of God. He does this by physical healings, by casting out demons. He does it through miraculous things, by showing control over natural disasters or storms. He shows that he is the Son of God by feeding 5,000 and 4,000 groups, or 5,000 people and 4,000 people with only a few loaves and fishes. And so it's through these different miracle stories that Mark uses to prove that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is God and is from God. In fact, let's go to Mark chapter 4, verse 35. It says, "That day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They were terrified and asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him.'" Now we as readers, we know the whole story. We know where all of this is going, even into chapter 15 and 16. But we know also from Mark chapter 1, verse 1, when Mark gives us the introduction of his gospel, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. We are told that from the beginning. But the disciples at this point were still learning who Jesus was. And Mark structures his gospel account in such a way in order to answer that question of who Jesus is. He spends the first 8 chapters addressing this question of who Jesus is, to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. And so going back to our discipleship process, we said we have to make a decision. We have to decide when we are called who Jesus is. We can say that Jesus is not the Son of God, and then the discipleship process stops. No need to go on more, because if Jesus is not the Son of God, why do I need to continue on the process? I stop and I go home and life goes on. But if the answer to my question is that Jesus is the Son of God, if I decide that Jesus is the Son of God, I have to make a second decision, and that is to get out of the boat. I have to then make another decision of whether or not I'm going to actually choose to follow Jesus. I have to decide if I am going to move. And if we decide to move and follow Jesus, then the discipleship process continues. You see, you cannot be a follower of Jesus and be still. To be a follower of Jesus, it means we have to move. We have to leave certain things behind and move towards Jesus. And that brings us to step 2 in this discipleship process, and that is the coming part. Step 1 was calling. We are called by Jesus, and then we make a series of decisions about Jesus and what we are going to do, and then based on those decisions, we then come to Jesus. But just like after calling, there was a sub-step, after we come to Jesus, there is another sub-step. And our discipleship process now looks like this. We were called, we made a series of decisions, we come to Jesus, but then we have to learn from Him. When we come to Jesus, we learn what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And like I said, Mark takes this discipleship process and he continues it throughout his whole gospel account. We said Mark chapters 1 through 8 is answering the question, who is Jesus? That's that make a decision part. And then all the rest of Mark chapters 9 through 16, is learning what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. After we choose to come to Jesus, we then read from Mark 9 through 16 and learn what it means to be a follower of His. And at the end of chapter 8, beginning in chapter 9, we have this transition point. From transitioning from making a decision to learning. And that transition takes place in the transfiguration. And so let's turn there in Mark chapter 9, verse 1. Verse 2. Mark 9, verse 2, it says, "After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, 'This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him.' Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant." And so, here we have this climax for our question of who is Jesus. They are coming up this mountain, and this voice from heaven, who we know to be God, says, "This is my Son, listen to him." God speaks to Peter, James, and John and says, "Jesus is my son. You see, what we have here is what's called an inclusio. It's kind of like bookends for a section, where you have the beginning and an end of a section, and they are marked, the beginning and end is marked by either the same word, phrase, or idea. And so if you remember all the way back in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, Mark writes and says, this is the gospel account of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And then you go all the way to Mark chapter 9, verse 7, when God is speaking to Peter, James, and John, and he says, this is my son. And so here we have this inclusio, this conclusion of this first section of answering the question, who is Jesus? Which is, Jesus is the Son of God. That Jesus is from God and is God. But remember, the discipleship process doesn't end there. It doesn't end with who Jesus is. It doesn't end with just making a statement that, yes, Jesus is the Son of God, and then life goes on. There's more to it. Now, I want you to remember who's with Jesus when he's transfigured. Yeah, there's Moses and Elijah up on the mountain, but then there's also James, John, and Mr. Speaks before he thanks Peter. And Peter's there, and I don't know what I would say if I was in that situation. I don't know if I'd say anything, probably. But Peter's there, and he says, "Teacher, it's good for us to be here. Let's build 3 shelters." Some translations will say booths, and some translations will say altars. And so let's talk real quick about what Peter's saying. Peter is saying, Jesus, this is such an awesome thing we are seeing. This is so cool. Let's build 3 shelters or 3 tabernacles or 3 altars to worship you and to just stay here in this amazing place where we can just stay here and worship you. But what we see is that they do not stay on the mountain. They come down off the mountain. So many times in our life, we are in that mountaintop situation where we feel extremely close to God. We feel like our spiritual life is on fire, and we feel close to God, and we feel like we are the strongest Christian we could ever be. And a lot of times those places come when we are maybe at worship, or we are at church camp, or we're on a retreat or whatever, or we're on a mission trip. But I think we have to remember what happens in this story. That we have to come down off the mountain and remember that we have to get to work. Those mountaintop experiences are great. They strengthen our faith. We feel closer to God. But we cannot stay on the mountain, because as followers of God, we have to come down off the mountain and get to work. We have to learn what it means to be a disciple. And part of learning what it means to be a disciple is getting to work. Let's turn to Mark chapter 10, verse 17. Mark 10:17 says, "As Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. 'Good teacher,' he said, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' 'Why do you call me good?' Jesus answered. 'No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not defraud. Honor your father and mother.' 'Teacher,' he declared, 'all these I have kept since I was a boy.' Jesus looked at him and loved him. 'One thing you lack,' he said. 'Go, sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me.'" This is a familiar account. We're told about in other gospel accounts. where we have this rich man. Some gospels say a rich young man. Don't know why they have to say he's a young man, but I'll take it. Maybe he's one of those millennials. That was a joke. But this young man, or this rich man, comes and Jesus tells him, go sell everything you have and come, give to the poor and come follow me. And if you read on, you see that this is a unique account because Jesus calls this man to come follow him, and this man makes a decision to not. Goes away sad because he doesn't want to give up what he likes. Doesn't want to give up his needs. Doesn't want to give up his wants in order to follow Jesus. And this text isn't solely about money. It's about letting go of everything, leaving everything behind in order to follow Jesus. In the high school class, we were actually talking about something similar to this idea this morning, and we said, you might say it's being willing to give up stuff, but it's not being willing to give up stuff. It's giving up stuff to follow Jesus. Giving up what we want. Giving up what we desire. Giving up what we think we should do for ourselves. And choosing to live for Jesus. Putting His needs and wants before our own. Choosing to live for Jesus instead of living for myself. And so continuing on in our discipleship process, we said that we are called. We make a decision about that calling. We then come to Jesus. We learn what it means to be a disciple. But then there's a final step in the process, and it's to go. Mark chapter 16, verse 15, Jesus said to His disciples, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." The final step is to teach others about this same process. It's a process that we are all invited to begin. But it all begins with the decision. We have to answer the question, who is Jesus to me? Was He just some guy? Was He simply a prophet? Or was He the Son of God, who came to die on the cross, be buried, raised again for you to receive salvation, and then for you to leave everything behind? Part of that decision of who is Jesus is deciding, is He worth leaving everything behind, giving up what I want to do, giving up what I know, giving up what's comfortable to me, giving up what's easy for me to do, and choosing the life of taking up my own cross and following Jesus. It's a process that begins with a decision. If we can help you in any way, if we can pray for you this evening, if you need encouragement of the congregation, we'd love to talk with you. If you haven't made that decision yet, if Jesus has been calling and you haven't decided to get out of the boat, to leave what's comfortable and what you know, and enter into that relationship, we'd love to talk to you about that as well this evening. If we can do anything for you tonight, please come now as we stand and sing. Free
Is for you and me. Let us haste, oh haste to its brink. 'Tis the fount of love from the source above.